Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of Full Court Press, an interview series focusing on hydrogen and the development of the industry as it moves from the paper on the page to the digging the hole in the ground and getting it moving around the world. We're delighted to be joined today by Mr. Alan Hayes. He's the head of energy transition pricing and market data at S&P Global Commodity Insights. Alan, welcome.
Thank you, Sean. It's a pleasure to be here and looking forward to a deep dive on a subject that is the top of a lot of people's to-do list, shall we say.
Yeah, Alan, let's kick off with that kind of top of the headlines, really. Ultimately, we've come out of a year, I think if COVID wasn't the dominant word in the global headlines of the last year, hydrogen couldn't be far behind it. You're in the Middle East this week, engaging with stakeholders here. How does the outlook for the building of a hydrogen industry in the Gulf compare to your experiences and exposure with the development of hydrogen ecosystems in other parts of the world?
A great question, Sean. Thanks for that. I think there are some similarities in terms of the starting point for why so many people talk about hydrogen is its potential to decarbonize our economies. And so that is a worldwide ambition. And the way it's connecting across the regions kind of drills down into how those regions sit in terms of whether they're going to become a producer or a consumer, and some regions, of course, will be both. But here in the Middle East specifically, there's huge potential for hydrogen to become another part of the energy supply that this region pushes out into the world. And so there's a huge amount of interest in this part of the region to get projects built and go all the way through to zero carbon hydrogen production based on renewable projects that would sit alongside the hydrogen ambitions. And of course, that fits nicely with other parts of the world, like in Asia, which has very well-known connections with the Middle East in terms of other products like LNG. And so we can see that kind of relationship between this part of the world and traditional buyers of products from this part of the world, like Japan.
When you look at this idea of hydrogen being the sort of magic pill, if you want, for decarbonization, which is coming out of COP26 in Glasgow, definitely seems to be the top narrative. I mean, obviously there's a lot of distractions with the war in Ukraine and all sorts of other challenges facing the world at the moment, but ultimately decarbonization is one of the big challenges the world faces behind all of these immediate challenges of war and so forth. But given that, are we really talking about green hydrogen as ultimately the only way forward, or does gray hydrogen, does blue hydrogen have a role to play in order to achieve that same objective of decarbonization?
Yeah, I think if you look at another key element of what is driving and what one of the enablers of the hydrogen economy, it's regulation from either government bodies or international bodies like the European Union. And that regulation is trying to do two things. It's trying to lay the foundation and give clear guidelines so people can have full understanding of investments that they would make and what the regulators are looking for. But at the minute, what regulation we are seeing is trying to do two things. It's trying to give that incentive to get money actually invested in real world projects, but without killing the potential to get as much hydrogen on the market as possible. And so that means that what the regulation that we're seeing that is helping to drive money in the ground is actually giving that flexibility that blue can or could be part of the solution. Because I think
so accepting that gas as the fuel source for hydrogen production is an acceptable in the context of defined as part of it being a transition fuel.
I think so, and for me, I think it's important to the way I think about this is that we have to understand where we're coming from and where we're going. Blue can deliver decarbonization because just because it can't deliver as much decarbonization as another alternative, shouldn't mean we take that off the table. If we can deliver decarbonization in a relatively short time frame compared to other options, then I don't think we should take that off the table because it isn't the best option. So again, in this part of the world, there's huge gas resources that can support quite significant amounts of blue hydrogen and blue ammonia in a relatively short time frame. If you compare that to places like Europe, where you're looking at a 10-year potential lead time just to get the legal permissions in place to build a wind farm to power your hydrogen. And so we don't really have the luxury of that timescale if we want to hit our decarbonization targets.
You mentioned there about the role of the EU and others in creating regulatory frameworks, but ultimately standardization in the hydrogen or in any area of new energy, as important as it was in the hydrocarbon industry, and even there, you would say over the decades, they struggled to get standardization into operations in hydrocarbons. Where do we see the progress towards standardization, and where does the burden lie to bring that forward or to advance it, do you think?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we are seeing slight variations in terms of that regulatory framework, whereas in some regions, such as Europe, you have firm thresholds of carbon intensity of the production profile, and you have to be below that threshold in order to hit what the regulators are looking for. Similarly, in the US, some of the potential incentives that are on the table there follow a similar pattern where tax support can be given if you can beat a certain threshold. Where on the consumption side in parts of Asia, there's less of this requirement for a threshold, and it's more about let's get this market established and get this product moving. But I think one other point I'd make around the standardization, one area where we think can help kind of make that problem go away if it does become a problem and in stifling the movement of hydrogen between regions, is to look at it from a measurement of the carbon intensity of production process. So when you can make a comparison of the different options of production based on its carbon intensity, whether you're looking at blue or comparing it with green, or comparing blue in this part of the world with blue in some other part of the world, if you understand the specific carbon intensity of this production in this location, then the market has a very useful metric to make comparisons that you can think about on a dollar basis, but also on a what level of decarbonization am I actually offering to the market, or what am I actually buying on a specific carbon intensity measurement basis.
Is there any one winning, any one surfacing as the idea that there can be a sort of consensus around, or plural ideas, or?
There are lots of ideas around how we can actually achieve the goal of having a widely recognized methodology to measure the carbon intensity, and there are certain academic pieces of work that can feed into that conversation. But we think it's so important for hydrogen that we've actually partnered with GTI Energy, which is a US-based non-profit environmental and energy research company, to work together with a broader base of industry participants to actually build towards creating such a carbon intensity model. And our ambition is to use our partnership as a basis to invite the whole of this supply chain that is trying to get this market off the ground, to invite them to work with us so the industry can actually partner and we can work together to try and get to that point where we have a methodology that is agreed by the whole supply chain.
There is a sense here in the Gulf that this, perhaps like predecessors in LNG to a certain extent, that first mover advantage is really the winning ticket here. Is that a correct assumption to make? What do you think about that from the board? Because we're obviously behind the curve to a certain extent on green. But what's your own thoughts on that idea that, you know, the first mover advantage, the ecosystem that coalesces first will be the winner rather than it being the best one?
I can see the logic behind that. I think one of the points I'd want to talk around the first mover advantage is on the technology side. So if we look on the blue route, so some of the technology around the carbon capture science and that technology will improve quite rapidly. And the model that we look at for technology more broadly across hydrogen is the renewables more generally. If you look at the cost curve and the learning curve and how rapidly the industry was able to bring down the cost of solar renewables, for example, if you
caught a lot of people by surprise, really.
It did. And if you overlay that on top of the hydrogen for electrolysis, for example, if you're looking at that technology, then we could see that technology go through a very similar reduction in costs. So while I think there's advantages in being first mover in putting this chain together, because, you know, as we were discussing, part of what we need to do is bring together that coalition of the willing in production areas. Like, well, almost every area of the world wants to be a producer of hydrogen of some sort or another. Regulators want it to happen. People in industries that are hard to electrify, like steel production, for example, are increasingly coming under pressure and are looking for solutions to decarbonize. So if we can bring that together.
We have a lot of those pieces here, i.e. big aluminium smelters, for example, where there is a kind of a domestic market for that cleaner power generation and cleaner, you know, steel production as a result. But the main actors in this region seem to be very much focused on an off-taker, a bit like you mentioned LNG model earlier. They're not really willing to put the billions of dollars into the infrastructure development without having secured a long-term off-taker like a power company in Japan, as was the case with LNG. How do you see that playing out? Is that a requirement? How would you even come close to putting a price around that? We still see LNG obsessed with pricing around oil.
Yeah, it's a central part of the conversations that we have. I mean, we speak to industry, that coalition of the willing, we speak to each element of that, and thinking around pricing is obviously central, because when you get down to the reality of putting money in the ground, as it were, and putting, you know, shovels in the ground, people who are behind these projects, they need to justify them, and part of justifying those projects is understanding the price outlook for those products that are going to roll off, whether it's blue or green hydrogen, and we're trying to be part of that conversation. We have a very wide range of prices that we publish, and those prices look at the cost of production on a technology and a feedstock basis, on a global basis, but using regional inputs, so you get the flavor of the pricing in that region. So, for example, we have cost of production for hydrogen using PEM electrolysis in the Middle East, but we also have the cost of production for SMR production. Sorry, that's when we use gas, steam methane reformation. So we look at all of the technology options and we say, okay, given the price of gas right now, what does it look like to produce from this production pathway? Given the price of electricity, which is the feedstock into electrolysis, what does that cost of production look like? So you can start to make those comparisons between technologies, but then interestingly, you can make comparisons between those technologies and different regions.
How about shipping? I mean, would that be a major part of the price point?
Yeah, so there's
Transport,
almost,
obviously, of hydrogen is pretty
yeah,
complicated.
yeah, we there's various ways that we think about this, and it's in some ways it's almost like a technology race, because putting hydrogen onto a ship and moving it from the Middle East to Japan, for example, that infrastructure doesn't exist at scale. And the technology of putting hydrogen on a ship is complicated. And those ships, I think there are one and maybe two on the order books. So that fleet doesn't exist. So a lot of the conversation about how we move hydrogen becomes a conversation about how do we move ammonia. From going from hydrogen to ammonia is a very well established production technology. The infrastructure for ammonia is very well established, and moving to low carbon types of ammonia puts no extra burden on that infrastructure. So the
How,
infrastructure, sorry.
go ahead, no, finish your point, sorry.
So that infrastructure is in place and is ready to go. The technology race I mentioned is between the technology to get hydrogen transported on new ships, or technology race to move it as ammonia and then recrack that ammonia back to hydrogen. So you kind of reverse the
Right.
production process. You go forward to ammonia and then you come back. But there are some significant energy losses in that reverse
And do we have
procedure.
in that that potential vision, as you articulated, a kind of an anchor reference for price, like we had with LNG, where we had oil, the long established price, and obviously the globally traded commodity that it is? What is there anything acting as an anchor for the outlook for the hydrogen price?
For hydrogen specifically, I think one of the ways that we think the market can build out to scale is to go from regional hub markets. So for example, where you have an existing industrial energy complex. So there are hubs right now where you have the energy source, whether that's oil or gas, and that energy source connects all the way through to a production process. So you may go from oil extraction to the production of olefins. And so in that process, there are existing uses of hydrogen right now. So one of the ways that we think we can build out or scale up the low carbon hydrogen markets is to simply replace existing uses of hydrogen within those industrial complexes. And then from there, you have the base to then look at prices within those regions. And you could have a hub in the Middle East, for example. You have a hub in Europe around Rotterdam. And then you can start to make regional comparisons. And then you can facilitate the movement of product between those hubs. And so I think it may be a second or third iteration of the pricing of the hydrogen market before you could say, okay, we have the Brent crude price for hydrogen.
Well, just to wrap up on that point, this on the importance, or there or not. I mean, coming out of COP26, going into COP27, as I said at the beginning of our interview, there's so many things in the world distracting from this conversation, but ultimately this is as critical as anything else in terms of the decarbonization of the global economy. Is the role of carbon, the pricing of carbon, that we didn't come out of COP26 with a carbon pricing agreement. We still don't have one. How much of a disadvantage is that for the progress of hydrogen, or does it matter at all?
I think it matters hugely for the energy transition, to understand, to make the energy transition sustainable. It has to be the most cost-effective decarbonization that is delivered, because that's how you deliver a long-term process that governments and citizens understand how much money is being spent to deliver this decarbonization. And an important way of understanding how much decarbonization is being delivered is by understanding the price of that carbon. And the market is almost moving ahead of regulators in this to some degree. We part of the energy transition team at Platts includes covering voluntary carbon markets, and we have a huge array of carbon prices across the spectrum of different project types for carbon. And we see huge interest in understanding and in some cases using those numbers from both project developers who are looking for a market to put their credits into the ecosystem, right the way through the energy system and all the way up into corporates who are increasingly on board with decarbonizing their supply chains as well. But I think to really drill down into the use of hydrogen as a decarbonization tool, I think there is so much momentum behind hydrogen. Again, it's racing ahead of the regulators, and the industry is almost, it's a couple of steps ahead of waiting for that price for carbon to come from regulators.
If there is such a big economic opportunity, it won't wait for regulators. Those who want to seize that economic opportunity will move ahead. And like many things, I suppose, it will be determined by those brave enough to risk and step forward. And perhaps that might be the Middle East. We're seeing Abu Dhabi, Oman, Saudi Arabia, all making strides. But we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Alan Hayes, Head of Energy Transition Pricing and Market Data at S&P Global Commodity Insights, for joining us this week on Full Court Press, the Hydrogen Interview Series.
Thank you, Sean.